This week's article on sexual offenders' modus operandi by Kaufman et al. Is about understanding sexual offenders' modus operandi, or MO. The article begins with a critique against current prevention methods against sexual offenders and then moves on to discussing needing better ways of understanding sexual offenders' MOs. MO means method of procedure in Latin. That is a quote from our textbook, Santos, 2017. But for the purpose of this article, the author refers to MO as where offenders find and have time alone with their victims, how offenders gain their victims' trust, bribes and coercion used by offenders to obtain cooperation in sexual activity, and offenders' attempts to gain victims' silence. That is, excuse me, quote from page 20 on Kaufman et al. Those 5 things also end up being the subsections of the questionnaire. So the article then touches on the difference between interviews and questionnaires in obtaining better data quality. The authors conclude that that questionnaires can substitute as an alternative to interviews. We then go into the details about the study, which the purpose of this study was to examine the difference in interviews and questionnaires between adolescent victims of sex offenders and from sex offenders themselves to obtain MO information. Participation was completely voluntary, and all participants were assured of complete anonymity. The participants consisted of 16 victims of sexual offenses and 32 offenders. 16 offenders were in outpatient treatment, and 16 were currently incarcerated. All participants filled out a questionnaire containing 230 questions called the MO questionnaire, which looks like Kaufman himself might have done, and then partook in interviews that consisted of 100 questions. The results show that both the interviews and questionnaires provided different information between the 3 different groups of the victim, outpatient treatment, and incarcerated offenders. The questionnaires were more beneficial when obtaining data about gaining the victim's trust, bribes and enticements to gain cooperation, and maintaining the victim's silence. The questionnaires provided more data than the interviews did for these 3 subsections with all 3 of the groups. For the other 2 subsections, sexual behaviors, the information from victims and incarcerated offenders did not differ. Only for offenders in treatment were their interviews more beneficial in providing data, or better data. To sum it all up, questionnaires provided more data for differing groups, and questions... Let me restate that. To sum it all up, questionnaires provided more data for differing groups and questions, as did interviews. This led the authors to assert that previous clinical assumptions that interviews were more efficient in obtaining information was wrong. Further, the authors state how allowing for a questionnaire may have provided offenders and victims more anonymity to answer honestly. It further allowed for greater recall of past events. The overall findings of this study are that using both interviews and questionnaires allows for the ability to obtain more information regarding offenders' MOs than using just one format. The findings implications can allow for more efficient assessment and treatment of offenders and victims, as there's more variations in the responses with both an interview and a questionnaire. Treatment programs for offenders could be improved based off information obtained from both forums about MOs, which could allow for treatment to be specific to the offender's needs. This could also help with relapse and early interventions. Limitations of this study are that it may not be representative of all offenders for sexual offenses. While the authors used both incarcerated and those in outpatient, these participants have all been caught and prosecuted. Their MOs may differ from offenders who have not been apprehended. Furthermore, MO behavior with low base rate may not have been adequately represented due to the sample size. The authors also note how the responses from offenders may have been affected due to their confidence in anonymity. They state how a study with a larger sample size and examination of offenders perceptions of confidentiality regarding their responses should be replicated. And that's it.